Welcome to Reformed Thinking. Imagine you're sitting in a perfectly sealed courtroom. The air is tense.
Oh, I can easily picture that. It is a very heavy setting.
Right. The judge raises the wooden gavel, strikes the sounding block, and delivers a final verdict. Now ask yourself a question about that specific moment. Is that verdict based on a rigid chain of evidence, prior laws, witness testimonies, and undeniable logic?
Well, you would certainly hope so. That is the whole point of a trial.
Absolutely. Or did that verdict just pop into existence out of thin air, completely disconnected from any prior influence or reason?
I mean, if a judge did that, we would call it a complete miscarriage of justice. We naturally want a courtroom verdict to be based on solid reasons.
We really do. We want a clear chain of cause and effect. But when it comes to the human mind and the choices you make every single day, people suddenly want the opposite.
Yes, they do. They want their choices to be completely uncaused.
Which is wild to think about. So today's deep dive investigates Jonathan Edwards' seminal theological work, Freedom of the Will. Our objective is to unpack his rigorous defense of moral necessity against the Arminian concept of absolute free will.
And we are approaching this from a specific angle, right? Both of us look at this text as Protestant Christians holding to the Westminster Confession, viewing these mechanics of human agency through the lens of Reformed theology.
Spot on. So consider this for a moment. If your choices are determined by your strongest desires, are you truly free? And if they aren't determined by your desires, are they even your choices at all?
That tension right there is the crux of the entire historical debate. It is fascinating how Edwards approaches this. He doesn't start with massive, abstract theological decrees about the cosmos.
No, he really keeps it grounded.
He does. He starts with the microscopic anatomy of a single human choice. He is looking at the fundamental mechanics of cause and effect in the human heart.
So, to really grasp this, we first need to define the opposing view he is attacking, right? Because you can't understand the defense without knowing the charge.
Precisely. The Arminian view relies heavily on a concept called independent self-determination. They argue that an act of the will is only virtuous or vicious if the cause of it, meaning the agent's independent, uncaused self-determination, is virtuous or vicious.
Wait, let me stop you right there because I want to make sure I'm grasping the actual mechanics of what they are claiming. Are they saying the moral weight doesn't sit in the choice itself?
Yes, that is their framework. You do not look at the action. You look at the uncaused origin of that choice. They believe you must be the absolute, unmoved originator of your action for it to have any moral value.
So if my strongest desire forces my hand, they are essentially saying I have no absolute uncaused choice in the matter.
That is their claim. And they ask, how could you possibly say someone is fully responsible for a bad choice if they could not have acted otherwise?
I mean, that Arminian view seems incredibly appealing on the surface. People want to feel like they are the blank slate authors of their own destiny.
They really do. It feels good to the human ego.
But when you map out that premise logically, you hit a brick wall almost immediately. Let us trace Edwards' logic here, because he exposes a glaring, undeniable flaw.
He really tears it apart.
He does. If the evil of an act lies not in the act itself, but in its underlying cause, then the evil of that cause must lie in a prior cause.
Think about how this plays out in real life. Let us say you choose to steal a car.
Okay, I am stealing a car in this scenario.
Right. If you apply the Arminian logic, you have to say the act of stealing the car isn't bad on its own. It is only bad because your underlying will determined it to be so.
But then we have to ask the logical follow-up question. What made my underlying determination bad? Was it another previous determination?
Yes. You end up pushing fault back step by step in infinitum. It is an infinite regress.
That is just a massive logical wall. If you keep pushing the blame to the cause of the cause of the cause, fault is entirely banished from the universe.
You can never actually point to anything and say, that is where the evil is. You are forever hunting for a phantom first cause that exists in a vacuum.
So how does Edwards cut through this philosophical knot? Because it sounds exhausting.
He states that vice is hateful because of its inherent deformity, not because it was produced by something else. This is a crucial distinction in Reformed thought.
The hateful nature of a thing is what makes it vicious, and the amiable, beautiful nature of a thing is what makes it virtuous.
Right. He uses the practical example of ingratitude. Imagine you donate a kidney to save someone's life.
A very generous act.
Unbelievably generous. And the very next day, they slander your name, steal your life savings, and mock your generosity.
Oh, wow. That is incredibly dark.
It is. But when you see someone act with that kind of bitter ingratitude toward a benefactor, Common sense tells you that the ingratitude is blameworthy because it is ugly and deformed in its very nature.
You definitely do not pause to run a philosophical calculation about whether a prior, completely uncaused choice produced the ingratitude.
No one does that. The deformity is in the disposition of the heart itself. The ugliness is inherent.
The ugliness is in the thing itself. That makes so much more sense than chasing a ghost cause. Edwards also brings up a fascinating quote from a contemporary American author who was making a lot of noise during that era.
Oh, this part is brilliant.
This critic claimed, "Unnecessary holiness is no holiness." He argued that Adam could not have been created originally in true holiness.
And why did he think that?
Because, according to this critic, Adam had to exist first in a state of neutrality. He had to reflect on his options and consciously choose to be righteous before he could actually be considered righteous.
But Edwards just takes a logical hammer to this entire premise. If the very first choosing to be righteous is what makes you righteous, then what made that first choice righteous?
It could not have been a prior choice because, by definition, it is the first choice.
That is a devastating counterargument. He shows that this Arminian logic shuts all holiness out of the world entirely. Let us walk through the mechanics of that.
Please do, because it gets a bit tangled if you aren't paying attention.
Well, if an effect cannot prevent the influence of its cause, and every choice must be preceded by a holy cause to be considered genuinely holy, then the very first choice to be holy has no precedent.
It has no holy cause behind it.
Right. Therefore, no door is left open for holiness to ever possibly enter the world. The Arminian premise demands an impossible contradictory sequence.
You must somehow be holy before you can choose to be holy, but you cannot be holy until you choose it. It is a closed loop of absolute absurdity.
And having dismantled that infinite regress so thoroughly, Edwards forces his opponents to reckon with how they misuse everyday language to try and escape this logical trap.
Specifically, they try to change the definition of what an action actually is. But wait, if common sense says we are just acting out our desires, why do his opponents use the word action so differently?
Because they have to. Their entire system depends on it.
What do they think an action actually is, then? This brings us to one of the most entertaining parts of Edwards' text.
It really is entertaining. Since the Arminian view requires this impossible infinite regress, you have writers like Mr. Chubb trying to create this highly specific, tangled, metaphysical definition of action.
They claim an action must have zero passiveness. It must be influenced by absolutely no external cause, yet it must simultaneously be an effect of the mind's free determination.
So think about what they are demanding. It is an effect, but it is uncaused by anything prior.
It is an effect of a choice, but utterly uncaused by any prior bias, motive, or inclination. I struggle to even picture what that looks like in reality.
You struggle to picture it because it is a definition that contradicts its own terms. Let us break down the psychology of what they are suggesting.
Okay, let's look into it.
If an action is an effect of the mind's determination, then the action is passive to that determination. It is being caused by the mind.
That makes sense. Cause and effect.
Right. You cannot be entirely active and entirely passive in the exact same respect at the exact same time. The Arminian notion of action requires it to be necessary because it is determined by a foregoing choice, and yet not necessary because it must spring from perfect contingence and total indifference.
It must be the beginning of motion, yet consequent on previous exertion. It is an absolute non-entity. It is nothing more than a confusion of the mind excited by tangled words.
They are trying to invent a category of reality that cannot logically exist.
And Edwards uses the most brilliant, biting satire to mock this fabricator category of reality. He invents this bizarre creature to illustrate the absurdity, the Terra del Fuego animal.
I love this analogy.
It is so good. Let me just lay out the traits of this magnificent, impossible beast because it is worth savoring. Edwards says, imagine a traveler returning from a far-off land, claiming he saw an animal that begets itself.
Right out of the gate, a biological impossibility.
Oh, but it gets better. It has a sire and dam distinct from itself. It is hungry before it even exists.
Which hurts the brain to even think about.
It leads its master who governs it. It takes a step before its very first step. And my absolute favorite trait, it goes head first while walking tail foremost.
It is hilarious, but it perfectly mocks the logical impossibilities of an action that is simultaneously an effective choice, but utterly uncaused by any prior motive.
You cannot have an animal that walks tail foremost while going head first, and you cannot have a choice that is an effect of the mind, but uncaused by the mind's desires.
The Terra del Fuego animal perfectly illustrates what happens when you abandon common sense language for the sake of defending a flawed philosophy.
When you look at how language is actually formed, words like action in common speech do not carry all this heavy metaphysical baggage.
Not at all. In everyday life, an action simply means a voluntary exertion of the body or the mind. When you say you did something, you mean you chose to do it, and your body or mind executed that choice.
You do not mean that your choice was a self-determined, uncaused origin that materialized out of a vacuum of indifference.
The Arminian divines try to force this impossible, contradictory definition onto common vocabulary, creating an intellectual edifice built entirely on sand. They're trying to win a debate by changing the dictionary.
That semantic game leads right into the next massive trap. Edwards exposes the definition of necessity. This is where things get incredibly practical for you as a listener, sitting in traffic or making decisions at work.
It really hits home here.
If our choices are necessarily connected to our strongest desires, how are we still to blame for bad choices? Opponents of Reformed theology love to cry foul here.
They definitely do. They say, if I must do something, you cannot blame me for doing it. My hands are tied.
But Edwards brings in this brilliant psychological insight about childhood conditioning to explain why we get so confused by the word necessity.
Yes, he points out that we learn words like must, cannot, and impossible when we are very young children, and we learn them entirely regarding physical constraints.
That childhood conditioning is the root of the entire philosophical confusion.
It really is. As children, our primary experience with the concept of impossibility is what Edwards calls natural necessity.
Imagine a young child who desperately desires to reach the cookie jar on the top shelf, but they are simply too short. They cannot reach it.
The impossibility is purely physical. It happens against their sincere will and their sincere endeavors. Common sense universally dictates that natural necessity completely excuses a person from blame.
You do not punish a child for failing to reach a shelf they are physically too short to reach. The physical constraint is entirely external to their will.
Their heart wanted to achieve the goal, but nature prevented them.
But then Edwards contrasts this physical constraint with moral necessity. In moral necessity, the impossibility lies entirely in the opposition of the person's own will and inclination.
It is not that you want to do the good thing, but a physical barrier stops you. It is that your heart hates the good thing so much that it is morally impossible for you to choose it.
And to explain the mechanics of this, Edwards gives us the crucial set piece of the two prisoners. Let us walk through this carefully because it paints such a vivid psychological picture.
We have prisoner A and prisoner B, both locked in a royal dungeon. Let us examine prisoner A first. Think about his emotional state.
He is genuinely repentant. He is weeping, he recognizes his crime against the king, and he desperately wants to fall down, beg the king's pardon, and reconcile.
But he is locked deep in a subterranean dungeon, behind strong brass gates and heavy iron bars. His inability to go to the king is a textbook case of natural necessity.
His will is entirely in favor of the action, but external physical forces prevent him from moving his body to the throne room.
According to the universal dictates of common sense, he is completely excused for not presenting himself to the king. No rational judge would condemn him for failing to walk through solid iron.
Right. We look at prisoner A and we feel pity. We recognize his heart is in the right place. But then look at prisoner B.
The king himself comes down to the dungeon, walks up to prisoner B's cell, strikes off his iron chains, and sets the prison doors wide open.
The path to the throne room is completely clear. There are no physical barriers whatsoever.
But prisoner B possesses such an inveterate, haughty, firmly rooted enmity toward the king that he spits at the open door. It is impossible for him to bend the knee because his hatred is so absolute.
His pride binds him stronger than the iron bars ever bound prisoner A. This is moral necessity. And what does common sense say about prisoner B?
We do not pity him for a single second. We place maximum blame on him. His inability to bow does not excuse him, it condemns him.
That is the turning point of the entire argument. It reveals a fundamental truth about human nature.
In common speech, the strength of an evil inclination is an aggravation of guilt, not an extenuation. Think about modern legal culpability or how we judge people in everyday life.
If you observe someone doing something terrible and you say, it is his very nature to be malicious, he cannot help but act cruelly, you are not excusing him from the crime.
You are highlighting the staggering depth of his wickedness. You are saying he is rotten to the core. The stronger the inclination toward evil, the more blameworthy the person is.
The Arminian framework tries to equate natural necessity with moral necessity, claiming both should excuse a person equally. But common sense, universally applied across all cultures, shows we judge them entirely differently.
A physical barrier excuses. A wicked, unyielding heart condemns.
I think this raises a natural follow-up question, one that is likely crossing your mind right now as you listen. If human choices operate by moral necessity, if our actions are necessarily tied to our strongest desires, why should anyone strive to do good?
Ah, yes, the classic fatalism argument.
Doesn't this make all human efforts entirely useless? If my future is fixed by an unbroken chain of causes and effects, shouldn't I just stay in bed, stare at the ceiling, and do absolutely nothing?
Why get up and go to work? Why pray? Why try to be a better person?
Exactly. Wait, I mean, precisely. It feels like effort is pointless if everything is already mapped out.
It is a very common misunderstanding of Reformed theology. But Edwards dismantles this fatalism by explaining the intricate mechanics of means.
In his framework, means are not outside the chain of necessity. They are not optional add-ons.
They are vital, integral links within the chain itself. When God ordains a predetermined end, that divine decree includes the predetermined means to achieve it.
The necessity of an event does not render the means useless. The means are precisely how the necessary event actually comes to pass in space and time.
Edwards uses such a simple, concrete analogy for this. He says, think about opening your eyes in broad daylight to see the world around you.
There is a necessary, unbreakable connection between having your eyes open in the sunlight and the act of seeing.
The fact that seeing is necessarily connected to opening your eyes does not make the physical effort of opening your eyes useless. It is the very reason you perform the action.
The established connection between the antecedent opening your eyes and the consequent seeing the light is what gives your effort any meaning at all.
If you want another analogy, think about eating to stop hunger. The necessity of food curing starvation doesn't mean you shouldn't eat. It's the absolute guarantee that eating will work.
And this is where Edwards turns the tables on his critics in a striking, philosophically aggressive way.
He points out that it is actually the Arminian scheme of indifference that renders all human endeavors and means entirely useless.
Think about the massive implications of pure contingence. If the human will operates by uncaused contingence, meaning it sits in perfect equilibrium and makes decisions completely independently of any prior motive, bias, or external influence, then no sermon, no prayer, no reading of scripture has any reliable connection to a good choice.
That is a staggering realization when you really chew on it.
Imagine a pastor preaching a heartfelt sermon to a purely Arminian congregation. If their choices truly do not depend on prior motives or on God disposing their hearts toward the good, then all the pastor's endeavors to influence their hearts are entirely vain.
The words just bounce off a will that operates in a vacuum. You could preach the most persuasive, logical, emotionally resonant sermon in the history of the world, but if the listener's will is truly contingent and uncaused, the sermon cannot cause them to repent.
Because if a motive causes the choice wasn't contingent. So under the Arminian system, everything you do to persuade, teach, or guide someone is essentially a waste of breath.
There is no reliable bridge between your advice and their action. If there is no fixed, necessary connection between an antecedent cause and a consequent effect, then your prayers and your endeavors are entirely untethered from reality.
You are shouting into a void.
The person who objects to moral necessity often falls into the comfort of sloth. They might say, my future is fixed, so I will seek the comfort of laziness. I won't even try.
But Edwards brilliantly exposes the logical contradiction happening in their own brain. By choosing laziness to gain comfort, they are still using a means to achieve a desired future end.
They are relying on the very law of cause and effect they claim makes action useless. They contradict their own premise just by deciding to do nothing.
They're essentially saying, because cause and effect are fixed, I will use the cause of doing nothing to achieve the effect of personal comfort. It is a complete, undeniable contradiction.
Now, when opponents lose this logical debate, when the infinite regress is exposed, when the definition of action is shown to be absurd, when the prison analogy clarifies moral necessity, and when the fatalism objection collapses, they often resort to simple name-calling.
Edwards has to spend time addressing the guilt by association fallacy. Critics look at his rigorous theology and accuse him of aligning with pagan Stoics and the notorious philosopher Thomas Hobbes.
It is a classic ad hominem tactic. When the logic of your opponent holds up, you attack the supposed associations of the logic to scare people away from it.
Critics cry Stoicism to discredit Calvinistic thought. The ancient Stoics believed in a form of fate, and Hobbes believed in a form of material necessity.
So the opponents try to smear Edwards by association, hoping the theological stigma will stick. But Edwards mounts a rigorous defense of truth itself.
Truth is truth, regardless of who happens to speak it or twist it. If Thomas Hobbes held to a form of necessity, that does not somehow invalidate the demonstrable, undeniable logic of cause and effect.
It is like saying mathematics is evil because a notorious criminal knows how to add 2 and 2.
Edwards points out that if the devil himself proclaims that Jesus is the Son of God, the statement remains entirely undeniably true. You do not reject reality just because someone you disagree with acknowledges a piece of it.
And there is a glaring, almost comical hypocrisy here among Edwards' critics. Edwards calls out Dr. Whitby, a prominent Arminian writer.
Oh, this part is just devastating for Whitby's credibility.
Whitby cited the Stoics' agreement with Arminian ideas as proof that Arminianism is true, claiming it beautifully aligns with natural reason.
But then, in the very same breath, Whitby cited the Stoics' agreement with Calvinists as undeniable proof that Calvinism is pagan.
That double standard exposes the total weakness of the critique. They use history as a weapon when it suits them and cry foul when it doesn't.
But beyond exposing the hypocrisy, Edwards draws a crucial, non-negotiable distinction between his theology and Stoic fate. He thoroughly rejects the concept of blind fate.
The necessity he defends is not a mindless, unguided machinery that rolls over the universe randomly, crushing people without purpose.
The necessity of Reformed theology is a universe governed by an intelligent, infinitely wise agent. God is governing all things by proper will, choice, and design.
That is entirely different from the mechanical, unthinking, impersonal fate of the ancient Stoics.
Which brings us to the theological climax of this entire discussion. We have established that moral necessity is undeniably true for humans.
Our choices are determined by our strongest desires.
But what about God? Does moral necessity apply to the Creator? Does God have free will in the Arminian sense?
Because the opponents charge Edwards with a terrifying accusation here. They say if God is determined by superior fitness and wisdom, if God must always do what is most wise and most good, then he becomes a mechanical medium of fate.
They argue this strips God of his true dominion, binds his hands, and turns him into a mere servant of destiny.
It is a weighty accusation, but Edwards dismantling it is perhaps his finest theological work in the entire book. He details 4 specific attributes of true, absolute sovereignty to show that God is not a servant to fate, but the supreme ruler of all reality.
First, God has infinite ability to do whatever he pleases without any control or restraint from outside himself. No one can stop him.
Second, he possesses supreme authority, meaning he is subject to no other authority and derives his right to rule from no one.
Third, he has an independent will, determined only by his own counsel. And fourth, he possesses supreme self-sufficient wisdom to direct that will perfectly.
I love how we look at that 4th point. God's will is determined by his own supreme wisdom. To the Arminian critic, being unable to do evil makes God look weak.
They want a God who has the freedom to act arbitrarily. But Edwards points out that being unable to act foolishly or wickedly is the ultimate sign of infinite majesty.
We do not look at God's eternal existence and say, oh, what a shame, it is a dishonor that God must exist. He lacks the freedom to not exist.
Yeah, we recognize his necessary existence as his glory. So if it is no dishonor for his existence to be necessary, why in the world would it be a dishonor for his holiness to be necessary?
The logic there is unassailable. If you introduce the Arminian concept of absolute, uncaused free will into the nature of God, you are demanding that God's will fluctuates based on blind contingents.
You are asking for randomness in the divine nature. Think about what that implies.
If God's choices are not strictly determined by his infinite wisdom and perfect holiness, then they are determined by nothing at all. That would introduce a massive liability to evil.
It would strip him of his absolute perfection. To act perfectly in every single instance without fail according to what is most fit and excellent is the very definition of praise.
The glory of moral necessity reaches its absolute apex in the nature of God himself.
It is stunning. God acting necessarily in perfect holiness isn't a limitation. It is the sheer brilliance of his perfection.
It means he's completely dependable, utterly good, and entirely incapable of being swayed by the random, uncaused fluctuations that Arminians call freedom. He's free to be perfectly, unchangeably himself.
To summarize the massive intellectual terrain we have covered today, Edwards demonstrates that true virtue lies in the nature of our hearts, not in some uncaused origin point hidden in the background of our psychology.
Human choices are necessitated by our strongest desires, which is the definition of moral necessity. This makes us fully responsible for our actions, because those actions flow from who we truly are at our core.
The use of means, like prayer, reading scripture, and preaching, are the very links in the chain of causes that God uses to bring about his purposes. They are not rendered void by necessity, but guaranteed by it.
And this entire system mirrors the glorious, perfect necessity of God's own holy will, always directed by his infinite, self-sufficient wisdom.
So, we return to that sealed courtroom we discussed at the very beginning. The verdict of your actions doesn't just materialize out of nowhere in a vacuum of indifference.
The verdict of your life flows directly from the evidence of your heart, your strongest desires, and your fundamental nature.
And that leaves you with a final thought to chew on today. If your greatest freedom isn't the ability to choose randomly, but rather having a heart that necessarily desires the highest good, how does that reshape the way you pray for your own sanctification tomorrow morning?
You aren't asking God to give you the ability to randomly choose good. You are asking him to change your desires so completely that you cannot help but run toward him.
Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. This is Reformed Thinking, wishing you clarity and grace. Farewell.